Howdy folks, my name is BKC. The music in the background is by Zame, that's Z-A-M-E on YouTube. And I am here to tell you the story of how Machamp took too much of the substance and went on a rampage for the last decade and a half of DPP OU, which has finally led the DPP OU player base to be so fed up with it that they are currently putting it through a suspect test. OU, being a past gen, does not receive regular suspect testing. The last time there was some sort of Pokemon change was in 2020 with the banning of Dugtrio. Well, Arena Trap, so people wouldn't try to replicate it with Diglett or Trapinch to cheesy results, but effectively Dugtrio. There have been some people in the last few days saying, hey, maybe we need to bring Dugtrio back, and no, we don't. Let's get that out of the way. Before Dugtrio, Latias was reintroduced to the tier in late 2018. So you hear these year gaps, and as you can see, we are not in the business of regularly getting rid of or bringing back Pokemon. There have also been cries to bring back Salamence, or to try Mew or Manaphy, or Latios. But none of those are on the table. We tried to keep a lid on that kind of stuff and keep it to the most necessary, and Machamp has most definitely earned the necessity. So, we do a lot of tiering in DPP generally, and in past gens as a whole, but it's more for smaller scale quality of life stuff. Think everything ranging from Baton Pass, which can be quite a menace, to minor stuff like Quick Claw, which just isn't doing anybody any good. So, this was not just done on a whim either. This must be made extremely clear, because there is kind of this idea that the DPP OU Council is this nefarious entity which is just, overriding the wishes of the player base and the people who know what's best. The DPP OU Council, first of all, is governed by a tiering council above it, and none of the members on the DPP OU Council are on that tiering council, so they have to get approved by senior staff. So, not only that, though, it's not like the DPP OU Council can just say, you know what, I'm feeling like, Kingdra is broken today, can we do it? No, they operate with the community very much involved. So, they do this by regularly keeping in contact with the player base and knowing who the players are and what the players are thinking. And a couple of times a year, they also send out a survey saying, hey guys, do you think anything is broken, anything needs attention? And responses to this can vary. There was a time where people were genuinely saying that Flygon was broken because of the mix set. Other time, the complaints are more valid. In more recent years, we've seen stuff like Clefable, Sleep, and of course Jirachi. So, a lot of players are wondering, hey, why not Jirachi? Why Machamp? And I promise we'll get to that. The first reason why it's Jirachi and not Machamp, actually, is that in this most recent survey, which is keeping in line with the survey done earlier this year, the qualified player base that was surveyed, the DPP OU Council sent them a survey and said, hey guys, what do you think is a problem? What do you want action taken on? A suspect test, a ban, something. 50% of the qualified player base wanted to get rid of Jirachi. 50%. That's, a pretty, high number, of course. But more than 3/4 of that same player base wanted to do something about Machamp. It was 76.5% exactly, which is pretty nuts. So, if you are the council, you are ostensibly supposed to serve the player base. And if you are serving the player base, then, if they tell you, if 50% tell you we want to get rid of Jirachi, and 76.5% tell you we want to get rid of Machamp, you don't just say, okay, well, we'll get rid of Jirachi then. Or we'll test Jirachi, I should say. No, you go with the Machamp, so that's why. And it is not really... It would be more of an issue if the council went against that request to do something about Machamp. Machamp was discussed earlier this year, but nothing really came of it. But then when the time came to discuss a sort of banned package, let's say, of things like Machamp, Jirachi, Latias, Clefable, Sleep, proposed by Council Member Deep Blue Sea recently, then a lot of people were wondering, hey, whatever happened to that Machamp thing? A lot of people, that didn't really seem to get resolved satisfactorily. Apologies if I phrased that less than eloquently, which I definitely did. But we get the point. So then this new survey came out and people said, okay, we need Machamp looked at the very least. So that is where this suspect test has started. So why do people want to suspect Machamp in the first place? We could make it as simple as LOL Dynamic Punch is stupid, but we should give it a little more substance. So basically, the reason why Dynamic Punch is quote-unquote stupid is because it goes against what competitive Pokemon should be, which is that if there's a move that's quote-unquote correct in every single situation, pretty much, then the move is too good. It dumbs the game down too much. Incidentally, this is why Baton Pass is banned. This is why something like Jirachi Ironhead is banned, because it almost doesn't matter what you're facing. You simply click that move, or click the very telegraphed chain of events, and there's very little need for thought beyond that. You just kind of click the move and hope it works out, whether you're running a BP chain or trying to Ironhead Heatran with Jirachi. It's pretty much just hope this works. But this is different from, let's say, Dragon Dancing with Dragonite and hoping that works, because the success of Dynamic Punch, and Ironhead of course, but we're focusing on Dynamic Punch here, it is entirely contingent on RNG. And this is not, like someone hoping for Ice Beam freezes with 10%. The 50% of a Dynamic Punch freeze is... Dynamic Punch confusion is very, very high. So, yeah, and with how hard Machamp hits, you can't exactly afford to hit yourself in confusion repeatedly. It is going to take you down very quickly. And the number of true counters to it are pretty much, relegated to UU Pokemon, Slowbro and Spiritomb. Slowbro is actually kind of a decent Pokemon, but it is completely unreasonable to expect someone to bring it just to counter Machamp. And it is, of course, very, very flawed, where Spiritomb is just complete junk. So for Machamp, you don't really counter it with anything, and whether or not your physically defensive Pokemon actually beats it is more or less reliant on whether it hits itself in the face or not, which is not good because it's out of both players' control. You just leave it up to dice rolling. Machamp is most famously on paralysis spam structures, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. Machamp is also commonly used as a lead, and it's even when it's not supported with paralysis, which doesn't necessarily mean paralysis spam structures. It just means, before the opposing team has been paralyzed, it just clicks Dynamic Punch very, very happily. So it's that's why the need for the suspect test. And if you want to extrapolate it further from, this is a cause for concern, into we think this thing should be banned outright, you can clearly see how when Machamp hits the field, it dumbs games down quite a bit. And I want to make something extremely clear here, because I think a lot of people get caught up in this point. They will say, well, Pokemon is RNG, right? So isn't this just RNG? Of course, Machamp is RNG. Of course, Pokemon does have a lot of RNG. Those things are very true. However, Pokemon being full of RNG is not an argument against Machamp's RNG. Because if a piece of RNG is too much, too impactful, then we don't allow it. This is very clearly outlined in how we do things in our tiering policy framework. But a quick example is that we don't allow OHKO moves. OHKO moves are all 30% accurate, but as soon as they hit, they get a KO. That's obviously too much. And the reward for getting lucky with the inaccurate OHKO move is a KO, and it similarly simplifies the game. When you've got a Pokemon with an OHKO move, This was tested out in Gen 5 Ubers, actually. When you had a Kyogre on the field with Sheer Cold, you pretty much just click Sheer Cold a couple times, and eventually you will KO that Latias or that Arceus grass switching in. You don't really work for it. You just have to get Kyogre on the field, not difficult, and you have to click the move and hope it works. Pray. That is an oversimplification for the game. It removes a ton of skill, and it reduces the game to dice rolling. Now, I am not saying Dynamic Punch Confusion is equivalent to OHKO moves. Please don't mishear me as saying that. What I am saying is when a piece of RNG is too much, then you remove it. Another way you can look at this is not every Uber Pokemon is equally Uber. An easy example, let's go back to Kyogre. Kyogre is one of the most busted things in Ubers, so obviously it's going to be too much for OU. Now, that doesn't mean we don't ban, let's keep the Gen 4 example, that we don't ban Salamence or Garchomp, because they're clearly not as broken as Kyogre, so we should be able to handle them, right? No, just because they're not as good as Kyogre doesn't mean they're not still incredibly busted. You know, if it's too much, it's too much. So the argument is that Machamp's Dynamic Punch overwhelms with its RNG, past the threshold of what is acceptable. And the backup, or to back that statement up, beyond just we think it's too much, is that you actually look at the way DPP games are played, and you see that it is regularly breaking through Pokemon it doesn't really have any business breaking through with sheer power. If it was using something like Bulk Up, which is a set I'm personally very fond of, then yes, you take matters into your own hands, and you are more able to break through something like a Hippo or a Skarmory or a Zapdos. But the way most people like to run Machamp is not with Bulk Up. They like to run Substitute because that best fishes for confusion and paralysis, of course. But it is maximizing your RNG. RNG maxing if you want to use Gen Z slang. So the point is that the way Machamp tends to be played is to pretty much click DP and pray, and that is not a very engaging way of playing the game. And when you are relying on dice rolls just to break through incredibly physically defensive Pokemon, that is unhealthy. And the fact of the matter is, you can look at it two ways. You can look at it as, this thing, turns the game into a dice roll, and, it's uncompetitive because it's too much RNG. Or you can look at it as this Pokemon can't be switched into by pretty much anything, even the physically bulkiest Pokemon in the game, because it just confuses its way past them anyway. The odds are actually so much in its favor that it's not even unlucky. And if it's not even unlucky, so either it makes the games into luck too much, which it tends to do, or it just regularly blasts its way through physically defensive Pokemon to the point where it can't even be considered RNG, as some people have pointed out. And at that point, it's like, well, what actually switches into this thing? Not very much. Another point I should make in this regard is that a lot of people will say, oh, come on, this is an old metagame. Do we need to touch it? Why now? Why not however many years ago? It's always some arbitrary number. Well, number one, because if a metagame is actively being played at the highest level in tournaments by a dedicated player base, it is inevitably going to be advanced. Strategies are going to become optimized, and that might very well result in the discovery of some broken Pokemon or strategies. We see tiering after the fact in all sorts of generations. Obviously, we try to keep it minimal. Some removing things like Baton Pass is not nearly as impactful. But sometimes, you have to get rid of that Dugtrio, to use another DPP example, or potentially, in this case, Machamp. Especially because they are more disrupting what the metagame has become and not really pushing it in a new healthy direction. It's a fine line between not fearing change and this thing warping the metagame to an unhealthy degree, which is what these Pokemon do. The other argument against, oh, why didn't we do this however many years ago, is if you were around in 2010, which is when Machamp really started getting hated, when the lead set took off, I think back then we were still very conservative comparatively with our banning philosophy. We did not ban anything but the most, something even as obviously broken as Salamence, took quite a lot of effort to ban. So something like Machamp, but that was a broken Pokemon that auto KO'd things and outsped the metagame with Dragon Dance, and it was just generally more obvious in its brokenness. Stuff that boiled the game down to RNG or team matchup like Machamp or again Baton Pass, that wasn't the kind of thing you really banned at the time. But the player base very much hated it. And whether it was a lead set or a substitute set on pair spam teams back then. And as pair spam teams have become increasingly optimized over the years, Machamp has become increasingly infuriating and difficult to deal with. So, with that in mind, people realize that, maybe it's not the healthiest thing in the world for Machamp to cause Pokemon to hit themselves in the face repeatedly. So, now there are some arguments against banning Machamp. They're not, don't touch this old metagame, because that is pretty fallacious and not really substantive. The arguments against Machamp tend to be more things like, it's not a very good defensive Pokemon, it's slow, it's hit by hazards, it's limited in terms of resists. It only really switches into Tyranitar safely. It can switch into Clefable, but it can't do so super easily. I can't even switch into T-Tar super comfortably, to be honest. It's slow, it's relying on paralysis. It doesn't actually get used that much in tournaments. It has a win rate that isn't exactly turning heads. And why isn't the bigger problem of Jirachi getting looked at instead? Those are the arguments. Well, the Jirachi thing we've already mentioned. But it's also worth mentioning that Jirachi is actually one of the most commonly used checks to Machamp. So if you want to get rid of Jirachi, then Machamp becomes even scarier. People often say, oh, well, Jirachi enables Machamp. It spreads paralysis for it. But if you look at the most currently successful types of Machamp teams, they don't even use Jirachi. Because the Jirachi Machamp teams often wind up being weak to other Jirachi. So you wind up wanting something more physically tanky or something more resilient, something like a Heatran or a Metagross. Something with more direct, explosive offensive power. So, as for the usage rate and usage stats and win rate, those are not really arguments, because the argument is not Machamp dominates the metagame to the point where it's all about Machamp. It's the point where Machamp's presence in a battle warps the game to be too overly decided by coin flips. Because you cannot really pivot around a Machamp. As soon as it's given the most bog standard support of Stealth Rock, then you can't switch around its dynamic punches, because switch-ins to it don't really take Stealth Rock particularly well. The one exception is Nidoqueen, which still is not a hard counter. Obviously, Nidoqueen does very well because it's Stealth Rock resistant, Sand immune, it even has Poison Point to potentially punish it, but it's not immortal. Ice Punch threatens it. And here is really the crux of why Machamp is an issue. It's that no matter what you have against it, you can pretty much always just click Dynamic Punch and pray, and it will be rewarded for it, far more than a Pokemon simply mashing its stab should be. Of course, there are many situations where using your stab move into resisted targets is good, but with Machamp, it is almost always the correct move. For example, Machamp clicks Dynamic Punch into Gyarados very early on just because, what else is it going to do? Stone Edge? That won't KO. I want a Dynamic Punch, and then I'll really mess it up, maybe even force it to switch out. This is a far cry from, let's say, Heatran using Fire Blast at the beginning of a game against a fully healthy T-Tar. Worlds of difference. Whereas with Machamp, you can force out your own checks and then force something else to switch in. What about Ghosts? Gengar gets obliterated by Payback, can't KO it. Rotom also does not take Payback well at all, even if it's defensive, whereas offensive sets could just get blown away. Can't KO it either. Lots of sets run Lumberry, so Will-O-Wisp isn't going to do it for you. So, yeah, and everything else is vulnerable to Dynamic Punch. Everything. And Jirachi Ironhead, for all its insufferable metagame dumbing prowess, it at least is weak. Now, I'm not saying pivoting around Jirachi's Ironhead is easy. It certainly isn't, especially with Stealth Rock. But, in comparison, it's nothing compared to Machamp's Dynamic Punch, which is coming off a much higher base attack stat with much higher base power and with much better coverage, both super effective and neutral. So, not even to mention that Confusion works on the switch. Ironhead Flinch only works against something that's staying in on you. You confuse everything, so you can't just switch around. No matter how weak it is, Confusion is a very good shot of just messing you up because 50% is a lot. And just one. And even if you break through one Confusion, if you've been following the replays on the screen, you may have seen breaking through one Confusion does not necessarily mean you're out of the woods. Breaking through one Confusion, Machamp, it's often cited, Machamp only has 8 Dynamic Punches. That's all it really needs. If it's a halfway competent player, they're only gonna spam Dynamic Punch against everything if they can see they can afford it. If you Dynamic Punch a Hippowdon, for example, then you don't follow it up with more Dynamic Punches. You use Ice Punch, because you hit it just as hard as Dynamic Punch, and you can also freeze. And if something else switches into the Ice Punch, then you can just Dynamic Punch that. Machamp is not a bulky Pokemon, that's true, but it's also not so frail that you can just kind of push it and it falls over. It is very good at withstanding all sorts of general counterattacks, as demonstrated in why something like Life Orb Gengar Shadow Ball isn't coming close to taking it out. So it just kind of gets in there and hopes for the best. So, yeah. Now, another reason why Machamp is being brought up as a suspect test ahead of Jirachi, as per the player base's wishes, is because Jirachi is a foundational DPP Pokemon. If you ban Jirachi, then a lot of the metagame kind of gets turned on its head. Jirachi is relied on for a lot, so it's understandable why the player base is generally more hesitant to abandon such a Pokemon, no matter how annoying it is. Whereas Machamp, on the other hand, Machamp more or less only exists to do this whole kind of confusion thing. It's a DD tar check. Great, there are plenty of good DD tar checks. And yeah, it fits nicely into offense and everything, but its whole offense is based in confusion and RNG. Yes, it hits a lot of things hard, but the reason why it's hard hitting translates into actual KOs so often is because of the RNG. So, Machamp does not really do much else for the metagame. And as a result, if Machamp is banned, the metagame at large does not really change. You are not losing a valuable defensive piece of the tier, holding the metagame together against major threats. It does not do anything irreplaceable on defense or even on offense. It's often cited that Machamp is a great stall breaker, but if anything, teams with things like Rest Talk Rotom, physically defensive Skarmory and Hippowdon, even like defensive Jirachi and Latias, these are, even throwing things like Gliscor and Bronzong, these are not frail teams that it blasts through sheer power. Now with a bulk up set, then yes, it is taking matters more into its own hands, but it's 4 hands. Excuse me. But that's not how most people are playing it. It's a matter of just dynamic punching and praying. Machamp is not actually a very good wall breaker in terms of sheer damage against those. It just kind of prays. That's the whole issue. In terms of actual wall breaking, against these kinds of teams, Breloom is just as good. It's actually better. It has more longevity, has a great secondary stab, sleep, arguably broken, but it's got Swords Dance, all sorts of ways to mess with the opponent. So, Breloom is much more reliable than Machamp at actually getting those concrete results, taking games into your own hands. With Machamp, your method of stall breaking, quote unquote, is just kind of, hoping you get lucky, which is not exactly, reliable, of course. It's either not reliable because the game's not in your hands, or the odds are so consistent that it's breaking through sheer numbers, which is also, unhealthy. So, regardless of how you're looking at it. Now, yes, so it's not irreplaceable on offense either. It's often said, slow, fat, greedy teams, they deserve to be punished like this. Like, these teams, if they really are that lazy in their team building, they'll get punished just as badly by Breloom. So, which is also much better defensively. So Machamp is really just the cheesy option for when you want to cut down on the skill gap between your opponent and just kind of dynamic punch your way through everything. So, what will the metagame look like with Machamp gone? I mean, really not that different. Paralysis spam takes a big hit. Now, if you want to abuse paralysis, you're going to have to use stuff that's hitting hard of its own merit, like Rhyperior, which has also been used on paralysis spam teams before. So, we can't really know too clearly what the metagame is going to be like, but the idea that it's going to become some stall paradise is just nonsensical. Like, yes, Machamp hits Clefable very hard. That, KOs most sets. Bold Clefable can actually live a dynamic punch. But, yeah, just because Machamp threatens the daylights out of Clefable doesn't mean it's a good stall breaker. It's a good stall breaker if it gets lucky. And if it gets lucky too much, I realize I'm repeating this point a lot, but I can't stress it enough. But Machamp can't even switch into Clefable reliably. It gets knocked off, and there go its leftovers into sand. Whereas Breloom doesn't care. Once it's poisoned, it doesn't care if it gets knocked off or not. It's a much better switch in, and it heals in sand no matter what. So, yeah, not much really changes in that regard. I think that is just about it. Oh, yes. If you're interested in participating in the Suspect Test, it is on the main Pokemon Showdown server. You just go on there, and you have to start a new account. You can't use an account that you have had already. You have to make an account. The account has to have been made December 16th or later, I believe. Yes. Create a new account. Yeah, it has to have... The account you use must not have played a game in DPP OU before the Suspect Test went up. So, no DPP before December 16th on your account. Just make a new one. The requirements to vote: 1600 ELO with a GXC of 85. So you just do /rank in the chat on Showdown, and you'll see it there. And once you reach that requirement, the deadline, of course, being Monday, December 30th, which is soon, so get in there. And once you reach that requirement, then you go here to the chat on Showdown, and you type in /link Smogon, and then you hit enter. I'm not logged in on the forums on my computer, but as you can see, that is the command. So yeah, /link Smogon, enter, and yeah. And if you want to see if you have qualified after you've done the link Smogon thing, the site does it for you. So let's say you've linked your new account, which is the Substance 2024, and you've linked it to your Smogon account, whatever that is, and then you can click on this little blurb that says here, and that will take you to this page, Suspect Test 62, Gen 4 OU, start time December 16th, vote options Machamp, do not ban, do not ban. And the users that have met the voting requirements thus far will be displayed here. So, here are the players who have achieved voting requirements through the ladder, as opposed to already getting voting requirements through participation in the most recent batch of our tournaments. So, that is basically it. Yeah, the ladder is very full of paralysis spam now, people wanting to make the most of Machamp and Jirachi, and yeah, get out there, experience it for yourself. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next one.